one interesting phenomena that I have come across during these, almost 10, 11 months this year, and today we are in October 2020. One thing that I've witnessed firsthand, being in the midst of it, is what we were talking about earlier, about seniority within the Sangha, within the monastic community. And these months, while I was living with, associating with monastics in the Buddhist tradition, I saw how, more so than before, by the way, associating, living with, than I have ever. And I have been associating with monastics for the past 30 years or so. One thing that I was struggling with is the idea of seniority, something that we call Vassa, which is the rains retreat, meaning the rains, how many, it's almost like the tree rings. When a tree is cut, or before it's cut, they take a sampling of it. It's like a drill, something like that, and they pull out this piece of strip of wood, and they look how many stripes it has. So it's very similar to that, or ice rings in the Arctic or Antarctic. So using that analogy, you see how in over the course of the centuries, to this day, when, especially in the case of bhikkhus, Theravada, monks, and nuns, of course, but I'm only speaking in the context of bhikkhus, because that has been my experience. A person's importance or seniority is seen through how many vassas or reins they have under their belt, so to speak. How many tree rings they have. And that has become the criterion for respect, for authenticity, for value, for importance, for legitimacy, for truth. Truth. And by truth, I also mean here, how much Dhamma does the person possess in their hearts, in their minds? So it has become an unspoken rule that the more vassas a person has, the more Dhamma they have in their hearts, which is utter nonsense. I can say this, I am a bhikkhu. And I say this in connection with the fact that, actually validated by the fact that, nowhere in the suttas do we see, anywhere, where the Buddha places a person's seniority as a criterion for their nobility. Seniority, again, with their vassas, with their nobility. Now, of course, there are segments that people argue today that these were later added by, those who were reciting the suttas, because for at least 400 or 500 years there were no writing. And ever so often there would be the councils, and these were added later, or even during, in between those gaps. And what were added? Well, you see this in the context of bhikkhunis, for example, that even the most senior nun Despite having been a bhikkhuni for so many decades, she has to walk behind the very youngest samanera, novice monk even, behind, when they go, let's say, to Pindapada or when they're going somewhere. And this has been creating more and more of a division, in my opinion, in the Sangha over the course of centuries. Now, of course, there are those, the list of, I think it was 8 items that the Buddha told Ananda, Venerable Ananda, who was trying so hard to establish the Bhikkhuni order to be by the Buddha. So he was trying to convince the Buddha of the need for the Sangha to also include a Bhikkhuni order. And the Buddha had given him the list of things, the criteria for Mahapajapati to agree to, and the other nun. Those women from the royal class who had come all the way to Vesali, with shaved heads, with bruised feet, walking barefoot, royal class women, princesses and even queen, and their retinue. And they agreed to the list of items. One of them was listed to be that, and only once they agreed to all these rules, finally the Buddha consented, under the condition that they would follow. Now, there are some elements, like the one that I just mentioned, that it is and can be argued that was later addition. But this can also turn backfires on the Sangha itself. Because unless we're talking about arahants, unless we're talking about noble disciples, people are just people. So when you give an authority to someone, just like in the Vimansaka Sutta, where the Buddha says, basically it's about the scrutinizing of a teacher, including monks, including himself, where we cannot know if the person has the lusting of the greed for power and fame and renown, for conceit, to set themselves apart and much a higher pedestal than everyone else, until the person is exposed to those variables, to those situations. So the person might be a nun or a monk, a bhikkhuni or a bhikkhu, who's so docile in their behavior, so kind, so this, quiet, respectful, when he or she is living in a hut or in a very small capacity, living without much fanfare. But the moment they are presented with a following, some reputation, the conceit will show up. The greed, the hatred, the delusion will show up. You see that even in noble disciples, unless the person is an arahant, of course. I haven't come across an arahant yet. But I have seen it in individuals who are noble disciples, and they still have those delusions, and it's no surprise to me because the Buddha talks about that. That's why they're called disciples in training, Sekha. The arahant is Asekha, by the way, the one beyond the training. Now, they've done their work. Now, if you notice, nowhere in what I just described, there's a mention of how many vassas does the person have. Unfortunately, when we're living in a time period where there is so much corruption in the Dhamma, meaning it's not being practiced. Only the outer, peripheral, not so important, in fact, totally mundane aspects of the Dhamma are being conceived of, are being embraced as the Dhamma. the rites and rituals of the tradition, the pujas, the ceremonies, none of which have anything to do with the Dhamma. Of course, these have sociological value, of course, to keep the coherence of a group of people coming together and creating that trend of looking forward to reconnecting. But these were simply these were simply tools that the Buddha used, opportunities for the community to come together and work together, but at the same time, obviously to make merits, things like that, and the laity would support the monastics, but primarily, the way I see it, they were there to create the opportunity for the Dhamma to be taught. Unfortunately, we've thrown away the baby with the bathwater. Because over the course of centuries, what you have is seniority over nobility. They do not mirror each other. That is something that I've noticed that is desperately missing. That understanding that the seniority ultimately means nothing if there isn't the ground, the rootedness within the Dhamma, in the person's character. In the person's character. You have so many examples in the suttas where a person is, in fact, not even they've never actually had a rains retreat, not even one single Vassa proper. They're a child. They're a child. 7-year-old arahants, for example. Arahant. And this was a problem that was also happening in the time of the Buddha, where a person would come and they would start fights. This happened in Savatthi, for example, a few times at least, that we know about in the suttas, reading them. Where you have a group of young monks who have found themselves appropriate quarters in the big monastery in Savatthi, and this group of other monks who claim to be more senior in their vassas come in and they say, you guys need to get out. So they kick them out. These younger monks. Younger only in Vassa. And there's a fight going on. They come in and they force them out. To me, that is more disingenuous. That is more harmful to the Sangha. This delusion that a person's vassas should be the criterion by which we can scrutinize a person, the character. Notice the Buddha never talked about that in the Vimamsaka Sutta that I mentioned earlier, which I believe is Sutta number 46 in Majjhima Nikaya, if I'm not mistaken. Unfortunately, though, we are living in dark times, even in the Dhamma. And I am not of the opinion that we need to hide this, to keep this within the Sangha, not talk about it. Otherwise, we are creating a schism, which is one of the parajikas, which is one of the defeats. That is not part of the defeats. When we come out and say what the problem is. It's like a physician who sees a problem, a cancerous tumor, and says, well, I'm not going to talk about it because, and I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to touch it. Because the person might worry. Well, what if the person is doing some things? What if the person is continuing to do, having, or has a lifestyle and continues to do so? That promotes the growth of that tumor. Well, I'm sorry, I just found a tumor. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to dissect it. I'm just going to let the person go on with their lives. And that's what people have been doing within the Sangha with these problems. Looking the other way. Well, I'll go and construct myself a monastery or a hermitage. that doesn't have that, well, good luck. Because there is delusion in the mind of this bhikkhu, no matter how many vassas. So I have decided for some time now that the criterion for respecting a bhikkhu is their capacity to know, understand, appreciate, and live the Dhamma. That, to me, is far higher than of any Vassa, which means nothing ultimately, if it's not manifesting in a character change, a personality change to be taking place within the person, and not their position in, okay, where can they sit? How far forward can they sit closer to the Buddha statue, for example? Nonsensical things like that. Those have become the markers for a person's seniority. Of course, some people who hear this, they're going to think, wow, that's the equivalent of, like almost like a Buddhist blasphemy. How could you say that? How could you be a bhikkhu and say these things, etc.? But the reasons for this, I always go back to the Buddha. Because the Buddha himself constantly said, when he was asked the question, how would we know if something is Dhamma or Adhamma in the future, Lord? He said, test it with experience. And most importantly, test it, put it, contrast it with what I have said. But there will be those people who will also add their own versions of Dhamma into the teachings. But those two you need to scrutinize. That is your responsibility. Not following like a blind sheep, like one of the fold. No, each person needs to do their work. They need to go and look for, okay, has the Buddha said this? Where is its legitimacy? Has the Buddha really uttered these words? And for that, the Buddha also gave this wonderful simile. He said, the taste of Dhamma is one, wherever you look. It's just like the flavor, the taste of sea water. Whichever shore you go around the globe and you taste the water, it will taste the same, salty. Similarly, he says, if it is my word, if it is true Dhamma, then it will taste the same across many teachings. So out of the 84,000 teachings that he gave, they all taste the same. Now there are some that really will stick out like a sore thumb. They are not his teachings. So I've addressed those in different talks. But today's, this conversation brought up this very important problem to be addressed, which is not being addressed. It's a tumor that is not being addressed. One lovely story that was related by Ajahn Mun from the Thai forest tradition. I haven't verified this because, it's something that is beyond my capacity. But he was known by his students and as an arahant. And in one of the stories that he relates, he was in deep meditation and he saw, so he's known to have said many things, including some of his students, like Ajahn Kao and Ajahn Mahabua, etc. So there's one incident that he relates, and he says that he was taken back to a scene, and there's all these bhikkhus, all shaven heads, living together in harmony and in silence. So he is there and is being shown this gathering, this great gathering of monks, Buddhist monks. And through his heart, his chitta, his intuition, he quickly becomes aware that this is the very congregation, very gathering of the Buddha and his disciples. So he's there. He's being given sneak, not preview, but he's seeing what was happening in the many instances that we come across in the suttas, where the Buddha says, at one time the Lord was staying in Savatthi, and one of the bhikkhus, after having paid homage to the Blessed One, sat down to one side and addressed the Lord and said this. So you can imagine the setting. So that is the setting that I'm referring to, that was being related by Ajahn Mun. And out of his curiosity, he looks around looking for the Buddha. I mean, that's what you do. You're going from the 20th century through this interesting time machine, if you will, of the heart, and you're getting a glimpse, a sneak view of what was happening. What was it like? What were they wearing? What was the exact color of their robes? How did their chanting, if they chanted, how did they sound? But most importantly, you're looking around at the front row, sticking your head out like a flamingo and looking and looking and looking to see, where could the Lord Buddha be? And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't see. The Buddha sitting there with his head, with that crown-like structure of a hair that we see in all statues of the Buddha. He didn't see that. And he didn't even see a person sitting there solo at a higher position, elevated position. He didn't see that. And he was surprised. And he had question in his mind. But then he realized his chitta, his heart, that the Buddha was not even in the front row. He was back there, several rows behind. Several rows behind. Because they would come in and start meditating, and sometimes the Buddha would come late. As you see in many suttas, where he comes and stands in front of the door of the gathering, the hall, until the conversation died down. And then the Buddha would clear his throat and they would know it's him, because he would not just barge in. He would not even knock immediately. He would give opportunities for those inside the door, inside the room, to, prep themselves up or become whatever, give them some forewarning. And then he would knock gently. So he would come in to many gatherings later than others. And he's not going to go, excuse me, push people over and then go up to the front and to the higher pedestal and then sit there. Those are just things that we added. I'm talking again about the seniority part. I mean, you're not going to get more senior than the Buddha, right? Everyone knows that. It's undisputable. But Ajahn Mun, he saw that the Buddha was sitting in this, call it a vision, sitting far back, and way back in the line, in the rows. Other bhikkhus were sitting up front. Now, the reason why I am relating this, because nowhere in the suttas, in my own studying of the suttas all these years, I have never come across anywhere where the Buddha places nobility lower than a person's vassas. We see it constantly when he is being critiqued by the Brahmin class, for example, who would come and insist that the Brahmin class or a person's birth dictates their nobility. And the Buddha always mentions the true Brahmin is not dictated by their birth. So birth does not say much about a person's nobility. It means nothing. It's a person's intentional action that dictates that. What and how are you living your life? That did not stop with the Brahmins. The Buddha's message did not end with the Brahmins, with the non-practitioners. That is the problem that many bhikkhus and the Buddhist community don't understand. That message still lingers. The Buddha's words are still alive, addressed to us as to how we conceive and understand and appreciate nobility today. Meaning, are my actions, my intentional actions, in coherence with the Dhamma? Am I practicing? And no, there is no room for bhikkhus who just become bhikkhus to be scholars and that's it. Yes, there were those people at the time of the Buddha, but the Buddha would call them stupid. Yes, there were the incident of the two brothers. One of them was much younger, a latecomer in fact. So many less Vassas we're talking about, who became an arahant. While the brother, who was supposedly teaching others. So he knew vast quantities of discourses, which says a lot at that time because we're living at the time of the Buddha at this point. And the Buddha would call this person an idiot, stupid, ignorant man. But the man could not, despite his, accolades given by his students, oh, our teacher, well, is your teacher an arahant? No, okay, there goes that argument. What is he a teacher of? So the teacher would get offended and insulted, but he couldn't say anything in response because it's his teacher. The Buddha is saying those things to you. I mean, wow. I've taught many years. It's high school and university, and I would just imagine, I try to imagine as an instructor, as an educator, turning to one of my students and saying, hey, you, the ignorant one over there, talk to him over there in the back, the idiot, the ignorant. Meanwhile, he gets, to be respected by others because he always gets the right answers. But when I go ahead and test his knowledge qualitatively, it's just like a flat note. There's nothing there. So I can just imagine the feeling of disrespect this teacher would have in the presence of the Buddha. But the reason why I mention this right now, is because of the lack of importance, the absence of any important credulity given to a person's Vassa. How many rains, how many tree rings do they have? When there is the absence of Dhamma in one's heart. And Dhamma is not about quoting the Buddha, it's not about, like I just did, mentioning stories. These have to have done their work on the person. Is the Dhamma alive in them, in their behavior? Behind closed doors. Or, in front of them. So, the Vassas ultimately mean nothing. To me, they mean nothing. They're like the tree rings. They're just like, tell me that you've been there a little bit longer. How? The Vassas will never tell us. Your behavior will tell you to the world. The Vassas don't tell us anything about the person. Give me 5 minutes with the person. Let me live with them. Let me see how they relate to me. The humility. Is there the kindness of Venerable Sariputta? The purity of heart? where he wouldn't even hesitate for a millisecond to bow down to this young little lad of, he was so young, and a young monk, not even obviously, junior monk, who criticized Venerable Sariputta because his robes were touching the ground. And Venerable Sariputta doesn't hesitate. He quickly rearranges his robes, and after he sees that it's not touching the ground, he turns to this young boy and says, "Thank you, teacher." Now recently, while I was in the UK, I was visiting a temple for less than one day. The intention was for me to stay there longer, but I decided that it was not the best place for me. But I related this to the chief monk of that place, and he challenged me that this was never happened. This had never happened. The Venerable Sariputta would never bow down to a young monk. And I told him, it is a fact, Bande. To this day, he refuses that. It happened. So there is that conceit that we need to be watchful, careful of. Not to become so deluded and so taken by our seniority, which has nothing to do with the Dhamma, with the robes that we wear. It just says we are deluded. We are living with the poisonous, nasty defilements in our hearts. So they are not stripes of legitimacy, these things that the Buddha called Vassas. They mean nothing ultimately. It's the nobility of heart, action, behavior, your thoughts, when the cameras are not running and you're not in front of the screen. When no eyes are watching you, yet you're carrying your life with nobility, because that is who you are. That is something that I will bow to, prostrate in front of. Not the Vassa. I do not care for Vassas anymore. You might be a younger Bhikkhu than I, but in front of the beauty of Dhamma that is in your heart, demonstrated through your behavior, not the words, then I cannot, it's so compelling, it's so beautiful, that one just has to show respect. And I will show respect to all beings, but never simply because a person has more Vassas than I. So I hope that answers your question and my position on this whole rains retreat and Vassa thing is.